Episode 7, Corn is Life. Hello, and welcome to the history of American food. This week, Squanto finally gets to come home, and I'll take a very oversimplified look at 3 ways corn and life shaped each other in the 17th century British colonies. So pull up to your place at the table, and let's dig in. As my library book piles have grown and my internet search history has lengthened in pursuit of 17th century corn, I've been impressed with how closely the success of the corn crop, good storage practices, and then later increases in yields would each determine how societies grew or struggled, whether there was plenty or people went hungry, or starved to death. In the 17th century, the lives of all the people living on the East Coast of the North American continent were tied to corn, either up close and daily in the fields, at one remove, just cooking and eating it, or 2 steps away, gathering profits from corn-fueled labor. The more I read, especially the words of people who live and work alongside corn, the phrase is said again and again and again, for it is simply true. Corn is life. The English colonists, coming from the green, yellow, and browns of wheat, barley, and oats, had to be a bit taken aback at the white, purples, reds, browns, oranges, and gold of corn. They saw multicolored ears with spots and stripes and different colored tips. This corn was unlike any other grain these colonists had ever seen. They must have thought of it as wild, confusing, and startling as both the land they were trying to tame and the people who already lived there. And at the same time, the colonists knew each night they went to bed with a full belly, but in a way their religious orientation wouldn't quite let them directly express. Corn was life, and without it, they would die. Every tribe and nation that the pre-Americans would have encountered already knew corn was life and expressed it with ubiquity, everywhere and all the time. The way they grew, harvested, celebrated, cooked, and stored their corn and corn pollen, and the myriad words they had to speak of corn, its parts and its uses, the way corn was part of stories, appeared in art, and was central to the organization of villages, task distribution, and social structure. The fact that corn could be a trade good, a gift, a reason for war, and how war was ended. And corn in some form was essential for any journey, as well as a way one knew they had arrived safely home. Tisquantum arrived back at what had been his home around 1619. After 5 years, 2 ocean crossings, and hundreds of miles over land on each end. Now I must return to and pause in Spain for a moment to iron out a detail I messed up about Tisquantum's arrival in Malaga, Spain. He and his companions were not sold. When Captain Hunt, who was known by his contemporaries as, quote, a bad man and a worthless fellow of our nation, unquote, and his kidnapping exploit. All of the English that heard of it condemned him, unquote. Well, it turns out Captain Hunt was not able to sell the kidnapped victims because when he took them to the slave market, they were recognized as native inhabitants of the New World. In the 16th century, it had been determined that such people, 1, were people, and 2, had the potential to become Christians, and thus were vassals of His Majesty Philip III, King of Spain, who was also Philip II, King of Portugal, Naples, Sicily, Sardinia, and Duke of Milan. As long as they had not declined the king's care, such persons as Tisquantum and his companions were not allowed to be sold as slaves in Spain, and that's why the friars of Malaga took them in. Extreme coin flips of fortune like this, completely beyond the control of the individual, were so much a part of the 17th century person that the prevailing fatalism and faith in providence starts to make sense. Anyway, after his rechristening as Squanto, his return to North America at Newfoundland, and his teaming up with Captain Dermer, he started his journey south by boat and by foot. As they approached his home, Squanto knew something was wrong. 5 years ago, at his forced departure, the hunting lands claimed by the chain of connected tribes and nations had been dotted with busy villages. 5 years ago, the area he was in had been full of people, their gardens, fields of corn, beans, and squash, their tobacco patches, and jealously managed foraging areas. But upon his return in 1619, Squanto found this area, from Maine to nearly Rhode Island, almost deserted. Letters and logs of contemporary fishing fleets hint that a disease epidemic, likely smallpox, measles, or a combination, had swept along the coast, killing between 2/3 and 9/10 of the population. Entire villages were deserted. Those who were left found one another and banded together. After such mysterious and unstoppable devastation, survival, both physical and spiritual, requires work that is best shared, especially when every task is done by hand. So the Peconicat and Patuxet people Squanto rejoined, and that the Pilgrims would encounter, were a new tribe of survivors, reconstructing their lives after the 1616 devastation. The Pilgrims, for a whole set of reasons and an assortment of bad decisions, found themselves not in Virginia, but much further north, and landing much later in the year than they had planned, nearly Christmas, which, incidentally, they would treat as any other workday. To them, Christmas celebrations tempted one to idolatry of the Christ child and other similar popish practices. For the first deeply religious English people on the shores of America, it wasn't so much a war on Christmas as it was a studious lack of acknowledgement. As for that cranky captain of the Mayflower, who had had enough of these troublesome, whiny landlubbers and their cut-rate passage, well, he was more than ready to drop them and depart for much more profitable sailing tasks. Before selecting the riverside location of Plymouth Plantation, there were a few scouting missions ashore, including one where the corn store from a Nauset village was plundered. Villages near river mouths were usually spring through fall habitations where tribes would move to plant and fish in season. But it was winter, so the village was empty and the corn store unguarded. At the spot where the Pilgrims finally agreed to disembark was not the wilderness. It was an abandoned village and a farm of some of the Peconicat people. A village site had already been cleared of large trees, and corn and vegetable fields had been planted and set a few years before. Certainly it was messy, since having been abandoned due to the disease epidemic, but it was far from the wilderness, and this, as much as the favorable landing and river mouth, was why it was chosen. When the Plymouth settlers at last disembarked, it was due to favorable signs. In the way these separatists, and let's face it, most 17th century Christians thought, all extremely good and extremely bad things that happened were signs. The fact that they had found corn and pre-cleared lands were signs that they belonged in the New World. God had laid the corn in their path and had cleared this land of the heathens for their use. Yes, half of the original travelers died, but without that corn, possibly all of them would have. For them, it was in God's wisdom those people had reached the end of their life. This is not ridicule, but a window into how these people dealt with the vagaries of the world, the quintessence, if you will, that they felt they couldn't and maybe shouldn't control. For them, corn was life, but the corn, like all other blessings, was within God's gifts. They knew they were truly strangers in a strange land, and they must trust in God to guide them and their very strenuous works towards the rest of their destiny. Recorded in the journals of Plymouth Plantation, it was on Saturday, March 20th, when Samoset of the Patuxet made first contact with these apparently pitiful boat people that carried iron tools. Information and diplomacy were required, but Samoset's English was very limited. None of the colonists knew any of the local dialects, nor the general trade sign language. So he went away, to return with the apparently supernaturally fluent Tisquantum, or again, for the ease of the English tongue, Squanto. Squanto and a delegation seeking to do a little more diplomacy and trade appeared the next day. The Pilgrims sent them away, as they would neither trade nor do secular work on the Lord's Day. It was not until Monday, March 22nd, 1621, that the exchange between Squanto and the Pilgrims began. Not only would he teach them how to enrich the sandy, well-drained land by the river with fish bits, he would have to teach them how to catch the fish they would use, how to process the corn to preserve it for the lean times of the year, and so many other things. These voyagers were amazingly short of both food and the skills to acquire any. As for all those pictures depicting whole fish on the corn mounds, the fish themselves, cooked, smoked, dried, eaten. The waste parts were used as compost, but fish guts just don't look as nice in paintings. Along with how to use fish dams to catch the fish, Squanto had to teach the Pilgrims to stand guard at night to chase off the wolves that would come to dig up the corn hills for the rotting fish bits. Squanto was also there to negotiate access for the Patuxet and other tribes to come to the shore and harvest their usual seafood. As generally happens when there are large cultural disruptions, there would be intricate power struggles. In this case, it was between Massasoit, or the leader of the tribe, his brother, and Squanto, and others over the next several months. That first harvest feast absolutely did take place in the autumn of 1621, and more colonists seeking a place to exercise their righteousness would arrive. An uneasy stalemate that allowed for limited trade between the Plymouth plantation residents and the locals would be the normal state of things, punctuated with moments of amity, ceremony, and conflict. Tisquantum's adventures would come to an end when he died about 18 months after he created his role as chief diplomat and liaison with the Pilgrims. Better traveled than most of the colonists he encountered, Tisquantum died in 1622. And it was with this exchange that these religious refugees, seeking a place to escape the influences of a too popish English church, the temptations of the intellectual riches of the city life of the Dutch, and pursuing a chance to own land, that the inhabitants of Plymouth Plantation came to realize that corn was life. Of the three general groups of British colonists, the New England colonists would be the ones most directly dependent on corn. They arrived with the fewest skills and supplies, but likely more importantly, they had come to the New World precisely because it was new. They planned to stay. And while they wanted to make it as much like their ideal England as they could, they also had visions of a new Jerusalem. So they would also see a bit of the promise of the land as it was. Years would center around the clearing and maintenance of fields to grow ever more corn. These English people would express limited interest in many of the other plant food sources, most of which were just too weird to be happily adopted. Instead, they expended energy in the construction and then improvement of tools to mill corn, first by pounding it in large wooden mortars using a pestle, then a pestle attached to a sapling or a sweep to save the effort of lifting it. Later still, using imported stones, they would grind it with a hand-turned quern or millstone. Endless attempts were made to try to get this corn to behave in any way like the wheat or even the oats or barley they had left behind. The proud and skilled Dutch bakers wrote reams of complaints about this grain that refused to rise and stretch, and we will hear about that when I visit 17th century Dutch culture, if only to talk about and sample the first donuts in America. Over time, other grains would grow well enough to regularly supplement, but not replace corn. 17th century rye and cornbread would become something of a New England staple. Later corn would also be shifted more to an animal fodder, and a diet richer in eggs and dairy, fish, shellfish, chicken, pork, goat, sheep, and even the occasional superannuated milk cow or draft ox would start to lessen the importance of corn. As the English and French built larger presences in the Caribbean, these colonies could earn cash from exports to start to purchase wheat. But corn would be the staff of life in New England for the new as much as the original residents for the entire 17th century. All the same, some native preparations were adopted, and for the sake of convenience, local names were applied. The three most widely adopted still have a place in our modern menu. Samp, a laundering of the Narragansett word either Suppuan or Nasump, there is debate, was the mush made from the mortar-pounded corn. It became fancier over time with the addition of milk, sugar, and eggs. It can still be found on menus as hasty or Indian pudding. A version with a very different past also lives on as polenta. Succotash, another smoothed-out word from the same source, originally meant broken corn. But in the colonial kitchen, it became a mixture of whole corn kernels with the native kidney-shaped beans and sometimes other vegetable items. It persists even today and can take on regional additions like okra, onions, or peppers, as well as meat like pork or crawfish. I even grew up on the globe-trotting version from the freezer case, with the carrot cubes brought in from Europe and corn's old friend lima bean, brought up from Peru via Spain. My serving always ended up with a sad little pile of overcooked lima beans that I would reject due to their strange, grainy mushiness. And then there's the Algonquin apone, shortened to pone, was a flatbread baked next to or over the fire. While we know it best as corn pone, other starchy vegetables were used. Sweet potato pone is also still reasonably well known. This early recognition of the necessity of corn and the supporting cultures for survival is still visible today in the density of native names on rivers, regions, and even states in New England. Granted, many of the names are squished or laundered, or the origins largely forgotten, but the ghosts these names evoke are hovering, visible if you just barely scratch the surface. After all, the Disney movie Pete's Dragon was set in Passamaquoddy, and that is no English name. The second version of life in corn happened in the early Jamestown area Virginia settlements and other areas like Pennsylvania, where people were granted small plots of land. While most of these Virginia colonists were there for the money, the rest were there because they could get land. And England and much of Europe was pretty much out of land. In the 17th century, land ownership was the base of just about every fortune and an absolute requirement for participation in politics. For these aspiring smallholders, it was about making a better living and the export of valuable commodities. The food and inhabitants already present in Virginia were of little interest. Much of the early strife between the English and the Powhatan, the Confederation present in the Jamestown area, arose because the amount of corn available was incomprehensible to the colonists/adventurers. Few, if any of them, were farmers, as shown by the listing of their occupations as soldiers, laborers, goldsmith, jeweler, and so on, and their early inability to feed themselves. Based on their experience, corn was a supply that is bought and stored rather than grown and processed. Early in the relationship, before it was clear that many of the colonists were lazy pests when it came to food, corn was pretty easy to trade for. The colonists had items that were desirable and useful: knives, pots, needles, nails, and so on. And they had arrived close enough to the harvest that there was enough to trade. As the year turned, the Powhatan were counting mouths and ears of corn. Through long experience, they knew what it took to reach the next harvest. And even without a bunch of freeloaders, the margin each winter was thin. Hunger was part of the cycle, but managed correctly, not starvation. So when colonists kept demanding corn beyond what was available, relations broke down. In fact, one point of contention between the local nations and colonial societies throughout the 17th century would be the locals refusing to trade for food. Colonists would be upset. Why wouldn't they trade if they had food? The answer, of course, was that there was only enough food, not plenty of food. That meant there was no food to trade for things one cannot eat. Corn would be a base for building a better living. The Virginia and Pennsylvania and other mid-Atlantic colonies had kinder climates for a wider range of English and European imports. So as skilled farmers with European plows arrived, corn moved to a supporting role. The better dirt and more congenial weather patterns meant wheat and other cash crops could be grown. Partly as a result of this dynamic, there is cornmeal in Pennsylvania, but no hominy, no grits. And while there are some place names like Chesapeake Bay or the Chickahominy River that recall the people who were there to meet the first colonists, the density is far less than up north. The third version of corn and life is in the colonies where huge blocks of land were granted to individuals. Virginia and the Carolinas, the large land block-owning Virginians were well-to-do Englishmen looking to expand modest but profitable domains beyond the constricted borders of England. In South Carolina, The dominant early colonists had moved from the crowded and economically cutthroat island of Barbados. Both groups already had a plantation playbook, funding from back home, and a labor force to hand. There would be none of this clueless bumbling about by gold seekers and religious philosophers. These guys showed up and transplanted their proven money-making culture. Sugar was right out. Virginia and the Carolinas were too cold, but rice, indigo, and tobacco were perfect. But these were export crops that required extensive processing, and you can't eat indigo or tobacco. So corn became the food to feed the labor force. The near total lack of corn, except as fresh kernels and rice and other vegetable dishes in late 17th century and early 18th century cookbooks and recipe collections, shows that corn was largely not consumed by the elites. But inventories and account records show that corn was the food of choice for indentured and enslaved black and indentured and non-landowning whites. It was also an important part of the winter feed for livestock. It is essential to remember that cookbooks and recipe collections of this era give a very slanted view of what people were eating. Most cooking was vernacular, that is, the familiar that everyone knows. The modern equivalent would be, say, a toasted cheese sandwich or scrambled eggs or a grilled burger. You just make it. There's not, really a recipe. And it was in the vernacular cooking where, one, corn culture lived on in the southern states, and two, the way hominy, that is corn treated with lye, made it to the fancy tables, and thus, finally, the cookbooks of the South. In the 17th century, no fancy British colonial lady was going to do her own cooking. She had people for that, and while she might supervise the cooking, there were plenty of meals where the menu was left up to the either indentured or enslaved kitchen staff. One thing this project has brought home to me is in the 17th century, a huge proportion of the black indentured and enslaved people working in the New World had been born in West Africa, or at the very least were raised by women who had been born in West Africa. These are people that were hunters, foragers, and farmers before they were captives and property. Unlike the European colonists who lived in a world of commodities and central mills, where nature had been flattened down to a bucolic dull roar, the West Africans carried the knowledge of people who were used to the ongoing negotiation with the natural world. In the 17th century, both groups were cooking with very similar technology: open hearths, pots over coals, wooden and metal cooking tools. But the West Africans were far better equipped to survive if that next barrel of grain didn't show up, and they brought their way of cooking with them. Corn had been brought to West Africa by the Portuguese starting 200 years earlier. I still have trouble wrapping my head around that, but it is so. As a result, ways of cooking corn, along with other American transplants, tomatoes, peanuts, and chilies, along with African items like okra, eggplant, and black-eyed peas, and the Caribbean sweet potato that stood in for the African yam, came to the east coast of North America with the West Africans, and thus they became part of the vernacular cooking of the laborers of the South. The laboring classes that were farming and hunting for themselves definitely had interactions with the local tribes, either as trading or smuggling partners, or by escaping and joining them, or through an assortment of other unofficial, never written down cooperative ventures. Thus, the foodways, the use of whole hominy, pounded grits, and ground flour lived on in the background of the food in the southern colonies, just occasionally appearing as a novelty on the fancy dinner table in the big house. The place where lye-treated corn dishes gained ground was as children's food, for kids usually ate separately from their parents and were largely cared for by non-family members, even in only modestly prosperous households. Thus, grits for breakfast and corn porridges when you were feeling ill became the norm. Corn was food for the masses and comfort food for the elite. In the 17th century, corn in America moves from the center of native societies to the edges of the arriving European ones. It went from the complex hub of life on the East Coast to a commodity. Europeans had to have it to survive, then co-opted it, improved it for their ends, and then exported it. But they also tore it from its roots. In quite a while, when we get to the 18th century, I'll return to corn, and we'll be able to see what happens as the country collectively forgets where corn came from, and they make it all American. Next week, we'll begin looking at fish. Thanks for listening. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Along with any promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting media I consumed for the episode. Any comments or questions can be left there too. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. The link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter bio at THOA Food and in the show description.